everyone. Welcome to our session on addressing partnership risks. I'm Goldie Blumenstyk. I'm a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And obviously this is a topic of great interest these days because, well, because it's always been a great interesting topic. The pandemic and the recession have certainly complicated matters. Interest in partnerships is intensifying as institutions and their partners are looking for different alternative financing and different approaches. There's more openness to these kinds of partnerships, and there are more partners out there willing to step into the breach. And frankly, it's a little crazy out there right now. People are really uncertain about a lot of what direction things are going in and what their personal situations are going to be and what their institutional situations are going to be. And in this level of uncertainty, there is a role for these partnerships that's never been seen before, but also, you know, as the title of this session suggests, a lot more opportunity for both growth and risk. We have a terrific group of guests here today. LaMott, the Chief Operating Officer at Concordia University in St. Paul. Jessica Wood, the Senior Director and Head of the Education Section for Standard & Poor's Rating. Judith Eaton, President Emeritus of the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. And Vaughan, who's a Partner and Chair of the Education Practice at Cooley Law Firm. Thanks everyone for being here today. I want each of you come to this panel with a lot of really very specific and spot-on expertise, and I'm going to hit you up with a question about that for each of you. But I want to start out with more of a sort of a general question right now, kind of playing off the introductory points here. This is kind of a dicey time. I'm just wondering, does that make it a really very good opportune time for people to be considering these kinds of partnerships? Will it make people more open to these arrangements? Or is it going to make people sort of say, wait, we don't know what's going on and we want to pull back. It's so uncertain right now. And I don't, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to be so, over regulatory with my approach that it might just sort of screw up the deal. Let's start with Eric. You're in the position right now to be making these deals. Just generally speak about the moment we're in right now. Good time, or what do you see are the sort of the pros and cons of entering a partnership right now?
Sure. Well, thank you. And thanks for having me on the panel. I think, it really goes to that risk-reward capacity within an institution. Those schools that want to take advantage of opportunities when things are unclear, this is a great time to get into the space and start looking at it. But it is a relationship and it's a partnership. So, from our institution, we're actually adding OPM partnerships. Unique. We make a lot of testing on that. But if there's market opportunity and partnerships involved in it, from an institution standpoint, some of the schools that have talked to me, it's a way to get into the space without leveraging a lot of risk in many ways, because that partner is really an angel investor. They're investing in our institution, which is prideful, I think. If they're going to actually put dollars out forward thinking, they see great value in what we're doing and how we're doing it. So I see there's more people engaging in this space right now. They don't have a lot of resources themselves to invest in new opportunity, new programs. So the ability to find a partner that sees that is becoming more sought after, I think, by the industry.
Jessica, what do you think? I mean, you're looking at some of these deals in real time right now too. So, in evaluating some of these programs, what are the sort of the pros and cons right now of doing a deal in this climate?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, if we look back over the past 5 or 10 years, there's been a lot of growth in public-private partnerships, and we've seen higher education institutions looking to sort of outsource expertise and in many cases efficiencies in doing some of these partnerships. So there's been a lot of growth. I think if we look at what's going on right now, the higher education sector sort of at large is facing a lot of challenges. And even before the pandemic, I think schools across the nation have been facing, some enrollment pressures and other challenges. But if we look at today and we look at the pandemic, as you've mentioned in your opening comments, Goldie, there's just so much uncertainty. And I don't think in March we expected that this fall would look the way that it does across the country at a lot of institutions that are completely virtual, which has had a very direct impact on auxiliary projects such as housing and dining and parking. So I think given what's the challenges facing the sector, there's probably more need for these partnerships, and I think many institutions will be looking to do more of them. But as Eric mentioned, I think it'll come down to those partners' appetite for risk, because there is so much uncertainty.
And Judith, let's talk specifically about sort of the risk-reward notion here. What do you think about this time? Is this a a good period for someone to be embracing a partnership, or is it fraud?
Well, I don't know whether, Goldie, and thanks for having me, I don't know whether it's a good time, but it's a time that's driving necessity. We're thinking the unthinkable. You said it was a dicey time. We could also say it's a time of crisis, at least temporarily, although as Jessica said, we didn't think temporary would be so long. Let's think the unthinkable. And I think this is compounded by the traditional higher education sector's business model showing more and more strain and simply not working. So if you're in that much trouble with your standard way of doing business, and I would defer to Eric here, maybe you can go ahead and break the mold, if you will, with partnerships and face all the challenges, as Jessica is saying, that come with that.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'm honing on some of this panel's expertise here, and I'm going to go back to you, Eric, for this. Particularly, as you mentioned, your institution is engaging in some new OPM partnerships. You've also had the responsibility of picking up some degree programs from a sister institution. Maybe that's not quite the right word. Another institution, right. another Concordia in Portland that had to close down after one of its OPM relationships kind of blew up, frankly, among other problems there. What have you taken away from that experience there that you're now using and as you're putting together your online program management relationships to outsource management of some of your degree programs?
Well, you know, there's a lot of lessons learned inside of that, right? So first of all, does my institution have the wherewithal and the mindset to adapt dynamically to that changing environment? As you said, a sister institution closed for a whole host of reasons that might tie to one of their OPM partners and other things that I really don't want to get into, but the opportunity that their OPM partnership with a company called Orbis, which is nursing, and we had just started leveraging that. So our ability to adapt quickly is critical. And back to the institution's capacity to adapt to that is really one of those risk factors that an institution needs to look at. How quickly can my team adapt to that need? You know, an example, the school's closing. This nursing program has around 500 students. They need to continue. They've got a very short window to do it. You have the partner that can maintain the relationship with the students, the professional skill sets for the marketing and the back office work, and then the ability to absorb that through a standard operating procedure into ours just really requires a different way of thinking in higher education. But to Judith's point, we got to look at multiple streams and revenues, and in that adult sector, it's going to have to operate in a much faster way. So being a flexible is key. Opportunistic, I like to think of our institution as being very opportunistic as we work with partnerships, not just for the sake of having partnerships, but be very strategic. We look at it as a partnership relationship and not a vendor relationship. I think if a school comes into this as a vendor relationship, they are going to have nothing but problems. We're not serving up food.
What does that really look like, actually? What is the difference between on the ground, what's the difference?
Well, the difference really gets back to is conflict management, right? So we don't know everything that we need to fix when we moved into that situation in Portland. There were a lot of things that we had to adapt to, and it gets to the people. So the people within the partner, the people within our institution, and will they work together to problem solve, or will they work and finger point? And in higher education, sometimes our sister schools will say this is a vendor and they're not adhering to the letter of the law of the contract as opposed to the spirit. And then we're going to resolve those conflicts and work forward. I see that time and again, no matter what the topic is. In the end of the day, it's we're building a relationship that's not just for this year's fiscal budget, but it's going to go on for 5, 10, maybe even 15 years or more. And that means we need to find a way to dance together effectively.
And just to get very specific, I don't want to, spend our whole time just talking about relationships with online program managers, but are there one or two things in these, but since these are the places where there's going to likely be a lot of growth in the next couple of years, I think we should look at it. Are there one or two, spots in the relationship that potential landmines that people should be paying attention to? I think at their Concordia, the termination clause was which had a kind of a requirement of a very big explosive payment at the end. That was kind of are there one or two things where schools really should be watching for?
Well, especially to your point on the front end, don't just jump into it with the idea, well, there's this revenue stream, we'll make it all figured out on the back end. you want to have some very clear boundaries and roles and expectations. We talk a lot about the role and responsibility for the different individuals in this conversation so that we can hold each other accountable. And if we don't define that within a reasonable structure, it leaves a lot of ambiguity, which then ultimately erodes the relationship and the opportunity to be successful. And so we try to be very specific about those expectations, who's responsible, who's not, and then who's the team that's going to be working towards solution towards that. It's important not to just sign the contract and hope it's just going to run. It requires senior leadership buy-in to execute.
And Judith, I imagine you're somewhat familiar with the situation at the Concordia University, and I think there were a lot of issues there, and I guess some could argue that there might have been a moment where accrediting agencies might have been able to step in a lot sooner before the financial relationships kind of got to the point of no return. But does the system, you know, I know you're not directly an accreditor, you're an association of accreditors, but does the accrediting system work now to catch these kinds of issues? Should it?
I think that the accrediting community needs to be beefing up its capacity to catch these kinds of issues. We've had lots of examples, as you know, Goldie, over the last couple years where schools have had reviews, everything they get at least a bronze star, maybe a gold star, and then a year later or 18 months later, you're reading of enormous financial difficulty. So accreditors can do this. They need to do more of it. With regard to the academic dimension of the partnership, that's a separate issue, and maybe we will come back to that. But I am an advocate for accreditation, but I don't want accreditation stepping in too soon and getting in the way of the academic self-determination and the independence of the institution or OPM or several institutions involved. We have to handle that very, very carefully.
And routinely now, just to be clear, it's not like everybody who signs an OPM agreement to do an online program relationship with an outside provider. You don't have to go to your creditor to get that checked off right now, right?
It depends on the extensiveness of it, because, and whether or not it will be viewed, technical phrase, as a substantive change. And that has to do with the scope of the activity, the depth, the areas covered in the agreement, and a number of other things.
And so I guess that's still always a relative term, but obviously the scope of the deal is sort of relative, is the important factor here. So Jessica, you're dealing with some of these issues right now, particularly with not so much with online program managers, but I think probably specifically with some housing deals. As you mentioned, students are remote this fall and not in the dorms and not in the other residence halls. I imagine there's not a lot of things colleges can do right now to change their relationships. I mean, they made the deal, they built the buildings, but I've noticed in some of the ratings that you shared with us that one of the issues that you said that could mitigate the issues are sort of management decisions. There may be some things that colleges can do even at this point to fix things, but like what's that example of a management decision that can help a college right now if it's trying to deal with enrolled dorms?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think to Eric's point earlier, these partnerships, the P and the third P in P3s is partnership. And I think what we've seen is the student housing projects that have tend to be more successful are those that, the relationship with the institution is stronger. There's better communication between the two, and it's not just sort of a vendor relationship. Eric mentioned problem solving. I think in March, schools projects faced big problems. Schools were closing, and if you're a student housing project on a campus serving students of that institution and they're all going home, then your building was left empty. In many situations, as we looked across our rated universe, we rate about 60 of these student housing projects. In many cases, we saw the universities sort of step in, work with their partner, their student housing project partner developers, and offer refunds to those students and cover them. The university covered those refunds in some cases. In other cases, that was not that did not happen, and those projects, faced a fiscal 20 or faced a more of a financial gap in their operations and in their debt service coverage. So I think that was one example of a situation where sort of problem solving needed to happen and the two partners needed to sort of have that communication, and that was an opportunity where universities could help. Now, as we fast forward to, we've sort of had, in most parts of the country, empty dorms in the summer, but then we fast forward to fall, and so and we're seeing a lot of variation across the country in terms of housing projects that are actually full this fall, housing projects that are at 0%, depending on the, their sponsor institutions' decisions around fall. So in this instance for fall, when we have conversations with the projects that we rate, we have a member of the sponsor institution, the university, on the call as well. And in some cases, you hear the university saying, this project is very strategic, it's very important for us, we will do whatever we can to help the viability, the success of the project, so that it doesn't get into trouble in this uncertain year. And then you have other conversations where the universities have their own challenges, and they're saying, we just can't help this project. Like, we can't financially, we can't help it, even though we want it, we want it to be successful. So I think there's a lot of challenges and uncertainty right now, but I think the communication in those relationships is very important.
This is one of those cases where I kind of wonder where having a third party, the capital was great 5 years ago, but right now having a third party in the mix can be even more complicating, because if it was just the college and their debt holders, there's one kind of decision an institution can make. And when you bring in this other third party and that party's financial interests are also in the mix, I think there's a question that a lot of people have raised this year, is whether, our college isn't encouraging students to come back and to live in these projects, these 3-3 partnerships, because they have to make a debt payment, and not, are they risking students' health and safety? Are they risking their RA's health and safety because of that? So in this case, does it having a partnership kind of make it even harder?
I think it's challenging all around. And I think in terms of what you're referring to, I think there's been some news about, obviously there's pressure for these projects to fill the beds in order to sort of meet their debt service covenants and things like that. I think it's challenging. I think universities, though, sort of across the country, I think have been contingency planning and have been really very thoughtful about bringing students back on campus if they are, and housing dorms. I will say, for a lot of the projects that we rate, the institutions have put in place sort of de-densification or limits on housing occupancy. So for the housing systems that the university owns, in many cases they're saying, we're going to switch triples to doubles or doubles to singles, and we're only going to fill these dorms to 60% occupancy or whatever that number is, and then working with their student housing projects that are independently managed or owned to sort of work on some similar guidelines. So we have seen that, but of course that has impacted the project's occupancies as well. So I think it's a challenge. Schools are having to make decisions around health and safety, and then there are financial implications.
I don't imagine too many people anticipated a pandemic when they were drawing up these contracts 5 years ago, 8 years ago, but could there have been, or are there any that you even know of that sort of anticipated kind of a health and safety waiver or something that gives them a little bit more flexibility as they're thinking about these debt payments down the line? Just wondering if anybody had the foresight ahead of time to actually build some of these, safeguards into their contracts.
Jay may know better on those contingencies. I might turn it over to him. I think certainly as we're hearing this fall, we're hearing schools talking about the leases that students are being asked to sign and that there's additional language. But at the end of the day, if I don't know, my thought is, if a student or say a whole residence hall gets COVID and has to go home, I don't know how that stands up. I'd look to Jay maybe for what he's seeing or hearing.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Jay anyway. I guess I wasn't thinking so much of the student. I'm just thinking the other way around. If the university has to say, yes, we can't fill this dorm, we have to de-densify this dorm, does anybody have contingencies in their deals that sort of anticipate, you might not fill the dorm that year for X number of catastrophic reasons. Jay, what do you think? Answer that, and then I'll go to the rest of my questions for you.
No, we've had COVID riders in our contracts for years. Actually, no, you do build into these projects, terms and conditions that are going to require some type of modification. You have kind of acts of God provisions, you have unforeseen events, and, there are near-term events like hurricanes and natural disasters and things that you build into that you hopefully never read into your contract. Hopefully it never comes up, and that's fine. But it brings up an interesting point, which is, when these agreements that you enter into, whether it's kind of capital projects or academic support activities. And I know people refer to them as OPMs, but just to be clear, the M doesn't really happen. Okay, so the service provider is not managing anything. It's not an abdication. It's merely a delegation of certain things that they might be able to do cheaper, faster, stronger, or with more ready access to capital. So they're not managing really to the extent that people tend to look at it. But to your point, we've got situations where these agreements are usually 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, right? And the conditions that are present even a year ago are very different than they are now. So in the contracts that when we get the parties together, and we've been on the public side and on the private side, we put these together, we're like, okay, this is a great near-term fix for whatever you have for occupancy, for a particular program, for certain types of support. But 30 years from now, that's a bit of a stretch. So whether the regulatory environment changes, whether the academic environment changes, we build things into our contracts to say, look, if we get at a certain benchmarks, near-term benchmarks that we have to meet, and once we get beyond that, we need to get back together. And we need to have, to what Eric said, we need to have this constant line of communication. There's always, not always, most times there's a liaison between the university and the service provider, where there's that constant dialogue about how are things going? How can we do things better? How can we enhance what we're doing for you? So that you can always reform certain parts of these contracts to accommodate different things that are going to happen. And so we build into, a periodic resetting of responsibilities, statements of work, scope of obligation. There are termination provisions built in, but it's hard to write a contract for that long a period of time in a world that can, as we've seen, in a short period of time change. But even under the best of circumstances, higher education is much different than it was 20 years ago. So you're going to need the length of that contract to recover whatever the front end layout is going to be for your partner. So when they come in and do a program for you, or build a dorm or a parking garage or a parking project, that's a lot of risk on the front end. So when people say, well, these contracts are so long, well, that's because they have to recover the amount that they put out up front. So look, it's like a mortgage. We could do a 5-year mortgage, or we could do a 30-year mortgage, but we have to get back in what we put in, because it's not a gratuitous venture. So that's why they tend to be longer, to limit the financial impact on the partner for as long as they can. And kind of, you pay as you go, where the service provider pays up front. And that's one of the differences. But yeah, we definitely didn't foresee anything like this, but we do anticipate significant disruptions and try and build into the contracts. Look, if you're all like-minded, you want to get the same objectives, we'll find a way to make it work within the bounds of a contract. And if we have to change it, we'll change it.
So in effect, you're sort of saying, and maybe you've already been doing some of these, is like you have a 20, 30-year contract, but you have these benchmark moments in the contract where it can adjust for conditions.
That's correct. And just, when we talk about what Eric was mentioning, and it was unfortunate what happened at that other institution, in full disclosure, we've worked with service providers that were involved in that. So we don't want to get too deeply into that, but it does outline one particular point, which is service providers have risk too. So when they're dealing with, and I think you see it in the capital projects as well, when they go out with that significant outlay on the front end and say, I'll get paid in the back, a lot can change in between, right? There can be disputes, there can be regulatory changes, there can be pandemics. And so a lot of folks focus on the risks to institutions, and that's understandable because there are risks to institutions, but there are also significant risks on the service provider side or the supporting organization, because they're looking for a contract to have to go as long as it needs to recover the initial investment. And if that for some reason gets interrupted, well, then they're kind of stuck. So it is good when you go into it, kind of eyes wide open when you talk about these agreements in the very early meetings. What are our objectives? What's the definition of success? And what are we all expecting from each other to make sure that it works out for both of us? Because at some point over the duration of this agreement, if it goes sour, nobody wins. And so how can we try and anticipate a contract that's flexible enough to make sure it can adapt, but concrete enough to make sure everybody gets fully covered and meets the original mission of the agreement?
And Jay, are there some things that you've seen, and of course, feel free to name names, though I know you won't. Are there some mistakes that you've seen along the way that, are just sort of kids don't do this at home kind of moments that you've seen in deals where, it's important to, highlight for the audience?
Sure. I mean, sometimes you get agreements that are good in concept, but maybe don't contemplate the world outside of the parties. So you can agree with a service provider and an institution, this seems like a good idea between us, simplifying the interaction as two different entities. It never is, by the way, but let's pretend it's two, a university and a service provider. They fail to take into account something like the regulatory environment. And Judith had some really good points earlier about that. If you don't think about how this agreement's going to be viewed by the outside world, then it's very possible that something that you're contemplating doing is not permitted. And so you get into a situation where you're involved with a service provider to do something that you're not allowed to do. And so it creates additional pressure on the contract, additional pressure on the parties. That's why it's important to work with people who are very experienced with what they do. And there have been some years ago things that didn't work out very well, because what happened was the regulator didn't, found out about it later. And you don't have to go to the regulator for everything, but if it is something that the regulators do ask you to get approval for, make sure you do it. And WASC, for example, is an organization that put out, I'm sorry, yes, the Western Association of Schools and Colleges has essentially a checklist that says, okay, this is what you can do. We don't need to know about it. These are the things we need to do. We need to know about. And these are the things you can't do. So it's a paint by numbers approach to allow parties when they go into it to understand what those limits might be. And I think the other thing that parties need to do is make sure that they activate their constituencies, right? The people who are going to be involved in this process. Can't happen behind closed doors. Everybody's got to be involved, because if it's academic support, you're going to need the provost, the impacted schools. If it's support, you're going to need facilities. You're going to need your board, because there's a lot of folks who just are going to be very critical of this agreement. Not maybe the first year, the second year, but 10 years down the road. So let's make sure we get enough momentum that we have everybody, at least inside our organization and inside the service provider, on the same page and working to the same objectives.
Brings up a really important point, and I want to ask the whole panel this question. It's something I've been really thinking about a lot as I've been watching these deals unfold over the years and watching a lot of the campus controversies that grew up around them. It's like, do we have the right structures around these deals, and frankly, the right people in the conversations? I'm thinking, is there a role for maybe more an independent board member to be part of a governing model? A real role for the faculty senate that taps into the institution's expertise, not just an after the fact, please bless this thing. And maybe a real role for public accountability. I'm wondering, even if there are some public-private arrangements outside of higher ed that have these kinds of models that could really help in these situations. And really, I'd love the whole panel to kind of weigh in on this a little bit. Well, putting different people in the mix.
All right, if I could start out, Goldie, I think that in many ways, these partnerships have been built within the context of the framework of the traditional academic model. And to the success they're considered okay, they reflect that model. That is governance issues and the role of faculty, or authority over curriculum, or accountability, and to what or to whom. And I hope we're evolving toward a situation where the norms for a number of these partnerships are tailored to those partnerships versus echoes of traditional higher education expectations. That's how we get, I think, to real innovation. And I think it's reasonable to question whether the current regulatory environment, and for our purposes, it's federal government, state government, and accreditation, whether those are the right vehicles, current law, current regulation, current accreditation standards and practice, or whether we need to be thinking about a very different kind of regulatory regimen that would, all right, provide accountability, but encourage creativity in these partnerships.
Anyone else? Some thoughts on like?
Well, yeah, I would, if I could jump in there, because I think there's quite a lot of regulatory already involved. We've got the federal with Title IV funding. We've got in our case, we're HLC, Higher Learning Commission, so we've got that regional accreditation. We also have states. So the state of Oregon has a much different regulatory model than the state of Minnesota. Both have weighed in on these things. And then I think what we're seeing too with attorney generals out there now trying to look at this value proposition in the higher ed space. There's a lot of people weighing in on this new design. I agree with Judith that we in higher education need to continue to look to innovate, and that's going to require us to say, what is our craft? Our craft is that curriculum, the delivery of that curriculum, the education of our learners, but we also need professionals in the world that we didn't used to have, that we used to encompass inside of our walls of an institution. Marketing teams, enrollment teams, IT teams, that are so professionalized that they didn't use financial aid for now. You can actually outsource your financial aid and find partners that will do a better and more sophisticated job than what most schools can afford to pay themselves. So I think there's a number of regulatory pieces involved in there on the curricular space. You know, our faculty still have governance over that curriculum, what it is, how it's delivered, who's teaching it, those kinds of things. So by policy, we still engage that, but by practice, we need to be far more nimble, and we still need to find a balance inside of that space.
I guess the reason I'm asking this, though, is that's sort of going back to Judith's model. Faculty should be involved in faculty matters, but at the end of the day, some of these decisions ultimately have an impact on, you know, even if it's not a faculty curriculum matter, a business decision of one of these partnerships could affect what happens to faculty or what happens to people in the community if the college ends up going under or something, you know, dramatic happens. So I guess that's why I'm asking about this, you know, whether there's some role for some kind of independent auditor at the beginning of the process, you know, to just sort of be part of this deal, someone who doesn't actually have a direct financial interest in it one way or the other, who could look a little bit more objectively at it. I mean, we just had our
audit through, and I think Jay will speak to this, but auditors are now sharpening their tools to look at these kinds of things because they have fiscal implications for the ability for the institution to perform its function, particularly ongoing into the future. And so I think we are starting to see that happen, but I'll let Jay cover that.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. Auditors are there's a lot of eyes on, right, of these types of arrangements. Whether you have to go through a formal regulatory process for approval in advance, you're going to have it reviewed when there's a comprehensive review, for example, when they come out to take a look at your institution. That's going to happen quite frequently. The states are always going to be involved. But keep in mind, especially with the public institutions, there's built-in accountability right there because the public governing boards have independent members. And that's why it's important to kind of activate them early on. And also as a public institution, you're public. So your accountability is to essentially everyone. And so the more you can build up that momentum to say, okay, this makes sense, have it looked at by a governance committee that says, you know, I'm going to look at it from the outside in and not necessarily because I'm not going to benefit financially from it personally. I'm an independent governing person, to ask them for those kinds of things. And as far as these arrangements are going to be concerned, you're going to get a lot of oversight of what goes on here, either directly in advance as part of a consent process or as you go forward, student outcomes, longitudinal assessments of effectiveness. There are some really good reviewers of whether or not it's working are students. They're not shy and they will let you know what's going on. So you have a lot of points of feedback that you can incorporate into whatever mechanism you have institutionally to make sure you know what's going on and can address in real time and in a nimble manner what's happening in the classroom, in the residence hall, in the park, whatever it is, so you can keep that feedback loop open and always react. So I think that's already built into it.
If you were wise enough to develop a contract that allows for, you know, changes along the way, I guess, right? If there's no room for feedback later on, it doesn't matter. But I guess I will push back with you a little bit on this notion that it's always in the public interest. I mean, even public universities we've seen at Purdue, we'll soon see in Arizona, maybe whatever happens at UMass. You know, these are public institutions, but then they create these other boards that govern these things, and these are not necessarily subject to the same scrutiny as a public university board might. Jessica, can you come to my help here at all? Maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree, but are there models elsewhere that incorporate a little bit more of an independent voice in these partnerships?
I mean, I think, I don't know if I have a sort of dissenting view from some of the comments Eric and Jay have already provided. I think there is a lot of oversight. You know, some of the examples you mentioned, like a Purdue with a Kaplan and Purdue Global, and some of the other examples you mentioned, I think those are very long processes in order for those mergers or, those partnerships to come to fruition. And I think there's a lot of accreditation and a lot of sort of regulatory steps for those to sort of get to the finish line. So I don't know. I don't know necessarily that there is a need for more, but so I don't know if I have a different.
It's really more that there's more going on than people realize. I think as part of the conversation is that oftentimes faculty may not realize all those layers that are going into play because they are negotiations, and that's part of the challenge too. In a negotiation, there's a fair amount of behind the doors. At some point, it needs to be, the veil needs to open and show some of those details. But there's far more going on. Every single program we take actually has to have a review at HLC, and they're looking at those checklist items about oversight, ownership, and role and responsibility.
Goldie, that's where if we could reflect on, look, how did all this get started? It got started because of the relationship between a traditional college or university and a vendor. And we let the values and practices of the traditional college or university prevail and the values of the traditional college and university. If we want to step outside that, and we could, and I don't know whether it would be good or not, it may indeed be, we need to think about a different way, a different perspective, a different point of view in examining how these partnerships are put together, how they're managed, and what counts as adequate accountability.
You know, as I think about it, we look at the traditional model, just what Judith is saying, where it's totally locked down, the for-profit model, and then this synthesis between the two, which is really, I think, the new nexus of where higher education is going to. And how do you find the right sweet spot in there where you allow that entrepreneur experience, which is going to require outside capital because universities just don't have the resources, public or private, in general, to leverage forward, but yet have the latitude of oversight and control within the faculty politic.
And I guess, and let's take the counter question for 1 second here. I guess I'm also wondering, what's the risk of too much regulation? Judith, you've talked to me about this before, you know, does at some point, yes.
I think the risk of too much regulation is inhibiting innovation. And, you know, I've long wondered whether using regulation and innovation in the same sentence without saying without saying that they can't exist at the same time is an oxymoron. Regulation is there to control. How do you control and not get in the way of the innovation? And I don't think we have very many good answers to that. And we need to keep working on it. On the one hand, yes, there's an enormous risk with these partnerships. On the other hand, you have to have permission to fail under certain conditions, and you have to have the freedom to experiment. And I think that we're too often too tightly constrained, especially in the public sector. But I don't see anything diminishing that with the way our society's going, with the greater and greater willingness to have oversight and regulation in every field, not just higher education.
Jessica, I'm wondering, one of the things you pointed out in the housing projects, the housing development P3s, and in particular, that, you know, I think specific factors like liquidity and having good reserves are really important. But, and I mean, I think a lot of people go into this, you know, when they don't have a lot of liquidity and reserves, you know, it's a little bit more of a Hail Mary pass at some point. And I'm wondering, with the dire financial situation some colleges are starting to face, is there a risk that more people will start these projects right now without the adequate cushions?
I mean, I think that's possible. Yeah. I mean, if we look at sort of when institutions, I mean, Judith and others have talked about sort of innovation, and I think we have seen over the past, you know, 5 to 10 years, a lot of growth and creative thinking and innovation in the higher education sector. But a lot of that happens in more sort of challenging times. And when we look at, you know, sort of the environment today, I think we will see, you know, institutions are continuing to compete for sort of a smaller number of students as we look at demographic pressures and things like that. And then we look at COVID, which is impacting students' decisions around sort of where to go to school and whether they're staying close or going further away. And we don't know how long sort of those changes in decision making will last, and how long this pandemic and repercussions will last. And so I think that as schools during this time frame, as schools are making decisions around whether it's amenities or additional housing or those types of needs or other partnerships, online and otherwise, you know, those decisions are being made in this current environment. And so I think that the environment can't be ignored, that there is uncertainty. And so it is a challenging time to sort of move forward in some of these types of partnerships when the future is very unknown, at least the immediate future. So I think that will influence some of the decisions.
Yeah, and I think I'm sorry, Goldie, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeff.
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, every rule has a story, right? There's a story behind most rules we have in our world today. And there's been some example that they said, well, we've got to regulate to that. And I hear a lot of our clients say, well, you know, like regulation is the enemy of innovation. And I agree, it creates additional challenges. But in many ways, I think regulation just requires some additional level of explanation, right? You have to be able to help them understand what need we're trying to fill and why. You're not trying to say, don't enforce your rules. You're saying, give me the benefit of the doubt to show you I've done it before. I know how to do these things, and we're going to be in very close contact, right? If you're worried that we can't do something, don't say no, say do it in a measured ways. Do it in a way that we have regular reporting. Let me come see you, regulator, and explain to what I'm going to do. Let me come with somebody like Eric, and we can talk about why we think this works, and have them be a participant in the process. I think that helps a lot, because oftentimes these regulatory limitations are based on a misunderstanding or some kind of comparing it to something that really didn't work. Because as a former regulator myself, I have a lot of stories of things that don't work, and you may not know that as an institution or a service provider. But when we can share in those conversations and understand what we're trying to achieve, I think you can get a lot of movement. Judith's absolutely right. There are challenges out there, and regulation is by definition kind of backward looking. It's trying to remedy or prevent reoccurrences of bad things. But some of those conversations, and especially during COVID, and I think this is one of the opportunities related to what's going on with us now, is that you're seeing accreditors do things they wouldn't have done a year ago, right? Remote visits, waiver of in-person things like clinical training, other things that before they would say, there's no chance we can do this. Well, now we can, and because now we have to. And while these are uncertain times, the only certainty is they're still going to be uncertain. And in fact, a lot of the difficulties institutions are going to face, they probably haven't realized yet. Of course, you have the direct revenue issue with students who may not be coming back or deferring enrollment, but a lot of institutions that rely on tax support from the states in which they operate, that hasn't actually hit in full force yet. Right? That's going to be a lag. So expect it to happen. Even if the pandemic is taken care of, there's going to be some financial shortfall. So how can we creatively come up with a way within the existing regulatory constraints, or maybe with a subtle expansion of certain things that allow parties to come together to meet the common objective, which I think is shared. That is, take care of students, fulfill our mission. And at the end of this, people come out of it better than they went into it. And if we have those shared objectives, we can figure out the rest along the way.
So it sort of sounds like we actually have to shut ourselves down here in a minute here. So it sounds like the fourth P in the partnership is that whole regulatory connection here. You know, I wanted to ask 6 more questions, but I think we're about to wrap it up. Each of you offer like one word of advice going forward in this dicey environment that colleges have. I'm just going to go around the horn, say like one word. What should people be most paying attention to going forward in this, institutions and providers? Judith. One word.
Regulation.
One word.
Absence of trust.
Jay, one word.
Courage.
Jessica.
I was going to say contingency planning, but I'll say contingencies.
Hyphenated word. It's okay. Eric, get the last.
Hyphenated. Forward thinking. Forward thinking.
Great. Everyone, our time is up. We could talk for 2 more hours on this, I know. And gosh, if we had the questions coming in, it would even be, I think we'd be like turning our heads up, spinning our heads around at this point. But I really appreciate everyone's time. Thanks everybody for being part of this. Thanks to P3 organizers for pulling us all together. See you all soon in the real world at some point. Let's hope.
Take care.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.